Usually I talk to you about my convictions, and rightfully so after all. Why take the time to talk to you, for you to listen to me, agree, disagree, both. Today I would like to talk to you about doubts of mine, pedagogical doubts, ethical doubts, to a certain extent purposeful teaching is transmission of some righteousness in order to create an ecosystem where the student, future teacher in turn, will carry on the right from the wrong. And if there is no right or wrong, and it's only a question of taste about interpretation, then it's very superficial. It's all about, I like it that way, or such and such plays it the way I like it. Well, that's how my teacher taught me, because the example I had was very appealing. Though the reasons are right, not all reasons have to be reasoned. While faith is not based on reason, is based on the necessity to, or the wish to believe in what scares us or worries us or anxiousness builds in us about our finitude. So it gives us a solace, it gives us a consolation, it gives us a hope. And regardless if some atheists will consider it a storytelling like a irrelevant one, but the other ones, the agnostics, will say, well, we don't know, so why not? After all, is there a puppeteer or a clockmaker for all these puppets and clocks? The reason would call to make an interpretation out of some intelligent score reading, which would lead to an analysis, which would lead to a way of interpretation that, even if it exists by others otherwise, your reading would be the translation of your understanding of the notation of a given composer's intent centuries before you on an instrument of which it doesn't correspond, for ears who don't know other than the edition of the day that is making the international consensus of the global likeness, so that competitions can carry, auditions can go on, and people can sound the most alike possible on the piano, I mean, as in terms of interpretation or even in terms of accuracy, which somehow is the lowest denomination, and then the interpretation comes as like the extra value when it should be all in one, and therefore all come out of one. You don't just recite words you don't understand, even if you recite them in a way that is believable or appealing, but you have to put meaning into these phonemes, not just recite beautiful sounds, even if words are beautiful in their sense poetically. But if their purpose is to vehicle a meaning, then yes, you better play a Beethoven sonata meaningfully rather than beautifully, but that doesn't exclude the one from the other. But that's not where my dilemma is. My dilemma is, if in our generation, which mine means the students who we were taught by older generation teachers who were in fact taught by 19th century musicians. Therefore, the tradition, the editions, the urtext, the original copy, the necessity to get closer to the original fact, either the score or the notation or the edition or the the manuscript, the first edition, anything that brings us closest to what was the initial idea of the composer that we're supposed to play according to his wishes. And then today's system with overwhelming amount of recordings that can be heard mixed between those that could be considered legitimate and those that could be considered illegitimate according to the individual opinions of the ones. Glenn Gould in his lifetime was considered, when I was a student, by most of the teachers as a very dangerous man to listen to by the students, because he could sort of, because he's so different in his interpretations, seduced by his eccentricity, the malleable minds that we were, and perhaps thirsty and hungry for knowledge of how others read, heard, and felt or thought, and therefore performed the music we're to play, other than how our own teacher tells us. Not that we doubt, but perhaps we were curious, and the curiosity was healthy, was not unhealthy or against the teacher. Perhaps it was in part just to be informed. I mean, it's easy to say like that, but in fact, it was just pure curiosity without any ill intention, I would say. Perhaps a search to reassure ourselves that the way the famous Rubinstein or the famous Horowitz or the famous whoever the famous were, and there were many, not that many, but a few that were very important because they had that connotation of scholarly knowledge while virtuosic piano playing, you know, Arau, Gieseking, Kempf. It wasn't so much teacher versus performer because at the time a lot of the teachers and performers did both. Today less because the business system allows a successful pianist not to need to teach because the remuneration is for one concert what they would earn in a year as a teacher, and so inevitably it's more self-serving to play and therefore to shine, and then of course become wealthy and mostly therefore become influential, but not as a teacher, rather as a guide, a bit like Glenn Gould was when he was apart away from this concert stage at the time I was a student, as he purposely only recorded, which at the time was a novelty because very few people recorded, let less only recorded, he was the only one, and edited and prepared some kind of product of the recording that became independent from the concert performance of the piece, that came up with the unexpected of the moment. The piano didn't respond the way you expected, or perhaps the acoustics, and then the audience, and then somebody coughs in the middle of a very important note, and then you have a live recording that is supposed to be the beautiful emotion captured of the instant that was shared during this ephemeral, intense communion around the piece of music, but then when it's recorded and heard again in a distant, cold way and purposely critically, so it sounds like, oh well, I felt such an emotion that day as a listener, but it was in fact not that good. When the detail matters as much as the whole, then of course editing in a recording becomes a necessity for those who cannot play through. It takes concentration and technique, and at the same time an abandon, at the same time as a direction and a view of the line way beyond the horizon line of the phrase, perhaps even throughout the piece. So that kind of gesture conductors do have because they analytically see the piece since they don't play it, and they sort of pull the orchestra towards their vision of the piece. When they play, they can have a vision but betray themselves with their lack of technique or their lack of control on the piano that is perhaps anyway uncontrollable, since some keys don't repeat, or some keys don't play, or some keys don't anything, or sometimes just dull. And then they are supposed to always bring in every concert all the fruits of the density and intensity and subtlety of everything. I mean, you can't ask that even from a sportsman. Imagine if ask a tennisman, today the court will be round, but you'll play very precisely, right? And to the edge of the corners, like you do when you play on a rectangular court. No, you cannot just like that and be as subtle. You might build just a little bit more basic. So modern pianos being better regulated, acoustics being good in the concert halls in the sense that they resonate enough to cover some details that might not be perfect. But even so, I don't speak about this in a very critical way. To the contrary, I think it's an advantage when you have a beautiful climate that is kept constantly in the concert hall. The pianos don't have problems with breaking strings or the wood expanding or not. In other words, the humidity level, everything is under control regardless of the weather outside. So when a pianist comes, they have a reliable instrument that responds to their expectations and demands, rather, from the playing. And if the playing is subtle with legato by the finger rather than the pedal, with a close-up articulation from inside the key rather than the left foot una corda effect only, then of course it responds, but then you have the pedal for colorization, for instrumental timbrization almost, if I may say that word. But in the old days, before World War II, let's say, the pianos were kept in horrible conditions. They're irresponsive, and they were eaten up by humidity. In other words, they're unreliable, which is why the teachers of this 19th century tradition used to teach us lessons without pedal, right foot, I mean. So we had to play legato singing, as they used to ask us, all our teachers. And what did we do? Superstitions, no. Suspensions, neither. We did substitutions. For everything, in order to sing a consistent and when we asked them, so why, if we did dare ask, because there was another story about the hierarchy between the teacher, who is the omni-knowledgeable, and the student, who is just there to receive and not even question, let less ask. They would say something like, in concert you'll feel more free because conditions will be good and probably you'll have a good piano, and but you won't need as much pedal. You'll need it just to colorize it's almost like saying you can put some sauce in the food if you think it's too dry, you know. But the opposite is different, because if, let's say, you're used to practice with the pedal in order to connect all the legato, and the acoustic is very resonant, you have to then unlearn during the performance how to play with less pedal, which then will bring out the fact that you don't connect the fingers legato as well as possible, as everywhere possible, let's put it this way. Because obviously some disjointed patterns don't allow for consecutive fingering, that even substitution wouldn't help. But if you reach a certain percentage, I don't know, 60, 70, 80%, where you can satisfy the connection of the legato singing element of the performance without the pedal, you feel less dependent on the foot glue. And same thing about the dynamic range. If you play always a consonant or the vowel, or you want a resonance within the resonance without the consonant, just a wah wah repeated note, you have to repeat it within the key lifting. Well, that's if some keys don't lift, then you won't repeat. Then it will be a quote-unquote wrong note or whole. And then you'll go, oh, that's not precise. And the point of performance today is that everybody has to play reliably precise. And that's not wrong, but that's the performance situation. Now, I digress back to my idea of the dilemma that I want to share with you about the teaching of all of that, in the sense that our connection to the musical wish, thought, intent of a composer, that the teacher sort of hyphenated between the dead composer and the young student who needs to know how much, the causes or the effects, or how to deal with the how rather than the why. So the teacher has to give some, in my opinion, is a hyphen between the composer's intent and the student's wish to know how, the causes of the why. So you can put context about saying this instrument at the time didn't have enough length of sound, so he repeats notes in order to avoid having the empty harmony. Therefore, in order to play it today, you cannot hold it because it holds longer on the modern piano, because then that means you won't play the notes as written, but you have to play the meaning of the notes, then you have to repeat them inside the key. Take the risk that might not all of them repeat. I don't want to say that, because that is uncalculated risk and it's unfair. But on the other hand, it's giving them an option to imagine how to voice, to organize, to layer, to hierarchize, to sculpt, to have a cultivated performance, exactly like a sculptor cultivates the raw material and gets into the heartland of his work, which is what he extracts from the necessity from the raw material. And this is where the conviction starts being a little bit to shake, because in the notation, not everything is explicit towards the interpretation. You can, as a teacher, find logical connections and justify a choice in terms of voicing, tempo, phrasing, dynamics, according to the edition, obviously. But once you go beyond this, you have to look at the way the composer or the publisher of the composer, in the case sometimes, chose to display the texture. That's where it gets tricky, because you face not only the understanding of the score, where you would suggest to the student the causes from the roots that you see in the score for the way it's to be heard, intended or not, when the composers leave a purposely ambivalent combination in mind. So is it that the composers give you a banana peel under the finger, so to say, as an image? Because I'll take you to an example, which is the second variation of the 109 Sonata by Beethoven. That's how we hear it always played, because that's how it appears to be played once it's read, and thoroughly so. Well, not exactly thoroughly so. It's second-guessing the ambivalent intent of the composer. What does a composer want when they write for piano? They know that the instrument has only the piano sound. It doesn't have clarinet, flute, clarinet, oboe, clarinet, I don't know, violin. In other words, it's not a synthesizer of today or not an orchestra of yesterday. Therefore, it doesn't have timbres. It only has a piano color that can play loud or soft according to the name of the instrument, fortepiano. It can play, of course, detached and legato, and different, various subtle ways in between. The wet staccato, the dry legato, the over legato, the finger pedal, and staccato, of course, or very character staccato, or just interrupted tenutos for an emotional interruption rather than a character funny staccato. In other words, we do have aspects of expression of the instrument through its means, except we don't have capacity to have a different sound than the piano sound. Something more like shadows and lights, black and white for a film or a photo. When you have more or less shadows, more or less lights, and you interact with the capacity of three-dimensionality that the lighting brings to the depth of effect on the photo in black and white. In a way, it's more artistic in the sense that you suggest and you hint and you hide and you highlight here and that, this and that, according to what you want to bring out. The eyes, the cheeks, or perhaps the portrait's chin, if that is what you want to bring out. So it's a bit like a art photography of the early days, way before Photoshop, or the painters. It's exactly what they did in portraits. Okay, let's go back to the piano, since I always digress in my images. In order to give some kind of explanation, I would go back to this essence. So when you observe the right hand of Beethoven's writing, there are two parts which imitate each other in canon a step above. And in between, he ends on the held note with a trill, which acts not as the or embellishment, rhythm, measured trill in Bach, Baroque, but more like a vibrato of a singer or a string instrument, almost like a prolonging crescendo on a held note, which the action of the fortepiano wouldn't allow. Bebung possible at most, as they call it, when decide the key when you vibrato. But basically the trill was more effective for the crescendo. The neighboring tone becomes the exciter towards the crescendo of the repeated note. And it adds, of course, excuse me for singing, but that's the only example I can produce with my throat. But hopefully more convincing in the playing, right? A tight trill with pedal, possibly a trill with an accelerando. If you want to enhance the crescendo plus the accelerando in the trill, or just do it directly fast, straight, and only crescendo, or no crescendo and only the accelerando of the trill, or both. Oh, it's too much. Oh, it bubbles up. Oh, I cannot control. Oh, but it's too early, but I have to still do. And more of them, and of course the build-up is the melodic rise on the downbeats, where you could put the pedal to colorize. So in the old teaching, they would tell us no pedal other than on the downbeat. The rest you control with the fingers, the repeated notes in the chords in the left hand, and the trill inside the keys, so you don't bring all the dampers of the 88 keys up only for these 5. Or that's what they would have told us, the old generation teachers. But when you're in concert, you might indulge, as they would say too. So perhaps out of context, it's easy to say, oh, God, that was the old-fashioned teaching, you know. Learn restrictions in order to enhance your capacity of control of the touch control of your material, and then indulge. That's a pedagogical way of learning, by disciplining yourself or your student so that they can be autonomous and not dependent on the pedal for everything. Of course, in a very beautiful acoustical hall with very beautiful but very good, well-maintained pianos that respond beautifully evenly on each key, a dream for most pianists. It happens to be only in rare, great, expensive organizations, festivals, concert halls with symphony orchestras of big renown. And who plays there? Who is invited to play on those pianos? The top 1% of the world's most admired and therefore also advertised pianists. And so you could argue, okay, then they have no merit if I want to be purposely for the devil's advocate, and I'm not, but I'm just trying to do the dialogue here of the thoughts, to argue for the sake of it that, okay, they play everything detached, mezzo piano or mezzo forte for the precision. So all notes repeat, all trills are organized, and every note plays no matter what, always. So it's reliable. And it's just important to be reliable, because you have to sound as good as on your recording, since that's what people expect. After all, these recordings are everywhere and they're all edited. Nobody expects to hear a wrong note. It's almost like an anomaly. It becomes the not even discretionary. It is like as if you have a dictatorship of against the wrong note. I mean, keep away from it. That's sets you apart from the others, from the best. And of course, it doesn't mean that if you're messy, you're per se more musical. But if you're very clean and you're not musical, you would still go to the next round of a competition, because objectively, that's the only fact compared to the subjective opinion about your musicianship, what you bring out in the music, how you tell the storytelling, how you understand the meaning of what is supposed to be acceptable for the piece in terms of if it's pure music, or is it music that translates moods of situations, funeral march, I don't know, garden and birds. I mean, of course, everybody is entitled to their revisitation of the score. After all, that's interpretation in the essential meaning of the word, which is translation, right? So it can be lost in translation. We're already translating when we play on the wrong instrument for the wrong time period, for the listeners who don't listen to the music as the only music they know, as they did when they played Beethoven in Beethoven's time. They didn't hear Prokofiev, they didn't hear Gershwin, they didn't hear Ligeti, they didn't hear Boulez. And now they have to abstract themselves from having heard all these and dissonances and atonalism, posttonalism, microtonalism, all kinds of isms or lack of. But whatever it is, you have to go in abstraction and say, I'm going to listen only to Viennese 1820s and listen to it like people used to listen to it, and I'll play it like they expect to hear it. Well, we don't have recordings, obviously. Therefore, we have only the score. And that's where the dilemma hits. That dilemma that I want to talk to you since the beginning. I've delayed so much in context. Finally, we are at the heartland of it. So if you observe the score, imaginary is there. The right hand is written with upper stems for the first voice. And then the second voice enters a step above imitation in canon. So far everybody can understand that, except that during the second voice entrance with the imitation of the first, just a step above, dropping thirds, creating a fourth in between, rising. So it creates that sense of step-by-step rising, except that Beethoven notates it as if there are two independent parts with upper and down stems. So the first voice would be played with the left hand, the second voice with the right hand, then the left hand crosses over the right hand to play above the second voice, and then same thing for the second voice that rises over the first. So they overlap because they do this rather than this. They don't do, but because they're in the same range, within the same grasp of the five fingers, they blend, or so possibly suggested by Beethoven's ambivalence. They produce a blend rising, which is in fact musically the most natural thing to bring out, because it is the direction of the line, the flow of the statement. And when you put the pedal and the chordal rising in the left hand with the dominant ostinato débit, who can go against that? This is what is supposed to be the cause. No, I think is the consequence. It's so appealing, it's so obvious that even watching the score with the stems overlapping the two voices, if we were to really implement by playing louder and softer the two voices as they appear to be notated, if the notation translates the intent, then we should play demonstratively So the dilemma is, what do you do with the student? Case one, you don't even talk about it. The student never saw the relevance of the notated overlapping two voices in the same hand, in the same range, and heard recordings of others that are widely available, more than in my generation, obviously, today. And you want the student to be successful in their auditions, in their exams, in their competitions, in their life. You want to guide them right. You don't want to misguide them. You don't have a devious way to think about it. You want to be, you're responsible. They come to trust you and you have to give them the answer. Well, you don't have to be taking it always that as if it's a philosophical live or die situation, you know, faith or no faith, be or not to be. Obviously, I seem in my presentation from a silly factor to draw a conclusion that becomes a philosophical dilemma, which I consider to be important because I think the details create the combined the great accidents or the great ways of reaching forward. And so what's wrong with informing the student, bringing to the student not only the attention, the curiosity, and the importance of the notation that could lead to a demonstrative voicing, which, by the way, unfortunately won't be heard in most of the recordings they'll hear, where everybody just accumulates the beautiful rising, regardless if they decided to ignore the notation or they just considered that the beauty of the rising steps of the musical expression from G sharp to the C sharp justify their interpretation without even having to explain it or question it. So what happens now if I invert the values and I hear somebody play it like this? Will I consider that he or she is eccentric, didn't read the score, didn't consider understanding the tradition that we're not supposed to deal with voicings in the piano? After all, it's not like you're playing oboe and flute or clarinet and, I don't know, bassoon. Obviously, in an orchestra, you would have a dialogue with different timbres. You'll hear that they're different. They won't be louder or softer. They'll be just different on the piano because they are blending. Where was Beethoven in the first place then to have known that? Of course he knew that. So that's the problem, is that Beethoven is not teaching my students. I teach Beethoven to my students. So to say. So I take it at heart and I share with you my dilemma, because I could say if Beethoven wanted to bring out the duality of the two overlapping voices, he could have spread them and then you hear them very clearly that they're not blending, but the ranges, and he knew very well the orchestration and the string quartet writing. I mean, of course he knew that. He started writing piano sonatas in 1800 at age 30 on fortepianos directly, and he wrote plethora of string quartets, which was really his idiom, not to mention symphonies, which is the extended idiom of the string quartet. He knows orchestration, he knows about held sounds, which on the piano have to be repeated because of the short decay, or because he thinks the pulse is important as well. I don't know how much necessity or aesthetics, perhaps both, and it's up to him to know, not for me to guess. But in orchestrations, I can observe that often he would hold the French horn holding the common tones in the harmonization. And if I don't do it on the piano because it's written, and even if the modern piano can hold more, then I would be basically completely wrong, because I wouldn't be applying the intention of the notation, and therefore it's almost like making it into a recitation, word by word, syllable by syllable, regardless what it means or how it could be meant. If I play today, why do I have to repeat the chords? After all, they resonate. It's not my place as a performer, let less as a teacher, to translate the tradition, the intention, the original thought of the composer that the student entrusts me with, for which the student has bought the edition that is trusted to be closest to the original text, the ur-text. And therefore, it's all about finding through the text the answer of the best, which would be connected to most authentic. Let less if the instrument is not, the ears are not, as I said, the hearing is not, the understanding is not. Because if somebody had asked Beethoven, what would people play 200 years after you? He might have said Beethoven of his time. Perhaps he didn't think they'll play him. Or perhaps his ego was big enough to imagine they'll still play him because he would be so relevant, which he happens to be. And I think that perhaps, regardless how he thought about it, we do. That's why we play him, we teach him, we perform him, we record him, we write articles about him. We might as well have a doctoral thesis about the overlapping voicings in a Beethoven late piano sonata. And this is very important, perhaps silly, perhaps over importantly stated here by me. But why it's not silly is because there are two ways. Either I don't tell the student about and let their intuition answer their own interpretation and just let it go because there are more important things to deal with. Memorization, details, fingerings, articulation, pedals, I pass and more. So obviously we have to go to the essence. What is important? We cannot just consider that it's not important. Or we cannot say, oh, I'm going to hire guys. After all, we only have an hour for a lesson. I'll take more time, okay? Okay, I do, personally. And what do I do in that time? I give that context. I give that explanation. I can give that incentive to go beyond only what is acceptable or generally heard around. Not that is wrong, because everybody does. It's just that I want to know. If I do it, then I'll do it knowingly, so I'll be informed. And information brings doubt. That's the dilemma. I can choose to say, let them play with their intuition. Anyway, they'll be successful, and that's the whole point. Or if I inform them to be aware of this detail of notation, which could lead to an interpretation, which could lead to a way to play that is unusual, which could lead for them to be rejected by a given jury that is, in general, unfortunately, infuriated to whatever everybody plays, because it's the way it is. Everybody plays alike in order to succeed. Well, it's not true either. Obviously, not everybody plays alike. But be in a jury and listen to performers, and you would be surprised how much they tend to sound like the recording they liked. And you cannot blame them, and you shouldn't blame them. And it's not the originality that makes the better. It's not the eccentricity that could be considered to voice it demonstratively. And by itself, these few bars are few seconds in the performance of a piece, which one way or the other do not determine the complete interpretation's acceptance, praise, criticism, or adoration, whichever way you want to go. But in other words, in teaching, yes, that's what you do. As a performer on great pianos, in great halls, famous performer, you don't even have to explain why you do what you do. And if you do something eccentric, or considered eccentric, I would perhaps say, something personal, something a little bit different, it could be almost an advantage because you differ yourself from the other few 1% very famous ones. Or perhaps you do it for no other reasons than your own conviction or some way that your hearing, your analytical understanding brought you to do it, or just because you're rambunctious and you don't want to be like everybody and for the sake of it. Regardless, nobody asks you. It's not like you do a conference or you don't give a speech with explanation of your demeanor in performance. You just play. And when you play. But of course, you don't pass a jury. You don't have to expect a judgment compared to others. You just play on your own when you're the top 1% in the great halls on the good pianos that are well regulated, etc., etc. So the old-fashioned teachers taught us how to control on unregulated pianos in difficult situations. Okay, did it give us an advantage? No. It just made us more aware of what we can control with the fingers, but of course it was more risk-taking because the hand has not the same balance when you don't play just separately the elements, but you connect them with the finger pedal. And you could, of course, then lose some of the balance. A stretch becomes a bit more hazardous. You have a black key between two white keys and you hit it, or you barely touch it, and all of a sudden it's the wrong note. And of course, we want to be reliable and practical, and therefore, as a teacher, you also want to give a finger that avoids hitting that note. And so, inevitably, we try to progress. We try to be bringing the performer to not betray their practicing nor their understanding of the piece. And you can always tell yourself, for this kind of interpretational details that come from an analytical point of view or from an intuition point of view, they will grow in the piece anyway. There will be one day 30, 40, 50, 60, and they will teach it in turn, and they'll probably not even see that, or perhaps somehow at some point they'll realize it because they'll read it more when they follow the score of the student performing in lesson than when they played it directly from intuition memory when they learned it themselves, because somehow you bypass some of those details, and the musicianship, your intuition, the strength of the drive of your musicianship overrides all these details, which okay, are there, but might not be all justifying how your approach of the piece is. But through the first impression that you have with a new piece that everybody has played is to try to match how everybody plays. And the teacher is helping you to get there. That's the dilemma one. Then if you don't inform them, they will perhaps not see it or later. And perhaps they will just blossom it then and say, wow, there's more to it than what I thought. And that the students of their students in turn spend their lifetime to go through it, if they go through it. In other words, don't short-circuit or shortcut the development of their intellect. Just let them do it on their own and make sure that they play well enough to be successful on the present time, which is what you do with them. You don't, of course, you can consider as a teacher that you're sort of agriculture specialist who plants specific grains in the soil that will blossom in 20 years. And then by then, of course, the student teacher in turn will develop their own understanding, and perhaps, in other words, it's all this enriched path of companionship with the music score, even if it's a famous piece, or because it's a famous piece, not just for the purpose of playing it different from the others, which would be vain, but if it has a meaning to it. And so the question of the meaning and the musical intuition, which unfortunately sometimes are not the same. The dilemma of the teacher is to perhaps just ignore it in order to let the student grow into it on their own timeline, in their own life, and say, why take so much for so little of the time now that could have more urgent matters, which is build the piece. Then can always change a separate part later. I don't think it is, but that is what I could think if I'm devil's advocate. In the opening movement of the same sonata, Opus 109, we always hear this flow of beautiful harmonies. That's how it's always played. Okay, not always, mostly, for the purpose of being intellectually honest in my demonstration. And you look at the score and you realize that in fact every first note of the right hand pattern has a stem up and a quarter note, which means that he wants a certain thematic bringing out. Now he doesn't notate a dynamic range specific to that note, nor does he write slightly brought out, or un poco, or più mosso, or non troppo, non troppo, not too much, not a little, etwas somewhat, or whatever he writes in German often. We have this kind of nuanced indications, or there is none, except that stem that sticks out. In an orchestration, you could say strings or harp for the chordal arpeggiation of the succession of patterns, which are root position and 6 chords in a melodic bass line descending with patterns of passing tones. You establish E major. What else? It's beautiful, it is meaningful, but it's also mood setting. We are well, we are calm, we are peaceful. We don't know what will happen. Eventually, some bars later, we'll have a first accident with a cadenza that will bring us to other situations. Away from the formal 4-movement sonata, 2-theme development, ABA aria, scherzo with a B section and a ABACADA rondo form finale that Haydn taught and Beethoven did so rightfully in the first sonatas. In the late sonatas, 20-some years after he started writing some in his 50s there, he writes 2 movement sonatas, theme and variation movements like in this one. Haydn never thought of that. Perhaps that's why we consider, among other reasons, expressive reason mostly, I think. But nevertheless, the breaking or leaving away the form and the purposeful musical purpose to the expression of one's own expression feelings, the storytelling of one's idealized storytelling, legendary something, whatever it is, basically a novel in music, which is what they did. And the Liszts and the Schumanns and the Mendelssohns and the Brahmses of the later part of the 19th century, and Chopin, the ballades. One mood after the other, one section after the other, and then it doesn't have to make sense. It is more about setting moods and an emotional feeling. Either it's heroic, or is it tender, or it's both, or playful. The careless, playful, childish, when the theme of the ballad is relatively desperate at the get-go, and then you have... So you have moods that go, swing moods, basically human life. In one day you go through different moods because news come to you, or you think of things, or you daydream, or you're, But the formal 4-movement sonata, forget it. And so Beethoven, by the 109, is way beyond the formal. He starts with what can sound a fantasy or the introduction to a song. It sounds more like an accompaniment pattern of broken arpeggios. So I don't want to go further into the movement. The dimension of my example of the opening of this sonata is the fact that the stems say something about some kind of thematic material that is embedded, or is it only, or to be brought up, and how much. Is it a trumpet? Is it an oboe? Is it a clarinet? Is it a flute? Not only do you have color timbres of choice, but you also have dynamic ranges of how much it sticks out. If somebody plays the opening of the sonata on the piano, the overwhelming thematization of these stems, quarter notes, indication of the score takes you away from the atmosphere that you create in the opening of the piece. Through Beethoven's writing, obviously not yourself. And there's no upbeat, downbeat. Of course, it starts on an upbeat, but how would you know, since there are similar beats for each bar? You don't know which started, where it is. You're in sort of floating wellness without any grounded downbeat. Of course, if you bring out the downbeat, you break some of that mysterious opening that remains purposely, by Beethoven's choice, undetermined, letting you just stay there in a flotation of well-being, to create a mood of perhaps being so comfortable in this well-being that the accident that will happen will be even dramatically more so. But then why did he write the stems up? And how much did he want them to be brought out? And how much did he want a thematic material to be extracted out of the mood-setting harmonic progression of the sequence? So if you do too much, you ruin the atmosphere of the mood of the setting of the beginning. And if you don't do enough, then you don't play what you read. And of course, because it happens to be that everybody does that, or most everybody, to be honest, for the majority of the way people hear those opening, they privilege the flow to the thematic bringing out. So we come down to the point, do we listen to the music or do we read the music? Do we study the music by the ear and then play just as we heard it by everybody else? And what's the purpose of reading the score? Because if the score revealed to us a lot of voicings, a lot of overlapping textual subtleties that we have to find ways to program, I don't know the word, it's not program, it's probably more like display, but subtly. And because the note before the melodic note is the same, he has a repeated note, it becomes tricky. Because then you have a combination repeated note from the lower stem to the upper stem. If he really didn't want the combination, he could have written, or, of course it sounds cheesy and is wrong, but the point is that you have to still play it even with a repeated note, but not with the same indication of dynamic value, even if subtly less. So either you do it little to satisfy your intellectual curiosity, or you blend it entirely by suggesting that Beethoven didn't take it very much in account as an importance to be brought out, not more than in the slow movement. So therefore, if we study music through the score, we don't study it only by the ear. And if we hear how other people played, and they choose or chose to, therefore, let's say, erase some of these elements that we see more than in the score, we hear in their performance, then which one do we go to? And do we become, as a teacher, awakening the awareness of the student towards the written text to make their own mind ultimately? Do we risk for them to get confused? Do we risk as a teacher for them to get into the wrong message? Do we risk to trust that they will take the right decision ultimately on their own? Or do we just consider the teaching as a dictatorship that does what dictatorships do best, which is eliminate doubt? This way, you just think my way, and your way or any other way than my way is wrong. If you're not agreeing with me, you're against me. I don't consider naturally, please, that an interpretation is a dictatorship of any way. Let's put things in perspective. It's art, it's a pastime for most. We take it at heart because we're into it, musicians or pianists or teachers or students or music lovers, regardless of the level of our engagement in the details of the elements. And you know, as you say, you always want to know more about what you love, the person, the object of your interest, love. And so of course you become more knowledgeable. It's like an archaeologist. You can say, oh, does artifact look alike? No, of course not. But you see now the dilemma of the teacher. If you take the risk to reveal the ambivalence or ambiguity in the texture, you might confuse the student, and the message is, so what do I do, professor? In the answer, you should say, do what your consciousness tell you. Read and play what you read, or play what you heard from the other people's reading or misreading. Of course, then you enter in a judgment of value and you start judging others. What is my right to judge what others brought them to play the way they do, even if they ignore the stems, most of them? And if somebody brings out too much the stems up and down, does it mean it's better? Perhaps it's disturbing too much. And how much is too much? And who defines the good taste from the bad taste, the obvious from the hinted, the suggestive from the pedantic, the demonstrative? Of course, when you give examples, yes, it's easy to bring out, but perhaps it's just what Beethoven wanted. Something subtly embedded rather than something willfully demonstrated. And if you do full circle all my my talk of today and you decide to ignore all what you read because it's not relevant in your interpretational desire, intensity, expressivity, or simply put, in your intuition, in the purpose for which you in the first place play the piano, which is to express what the music means to you, not what it meant to the others. Of course, you listen to the others to reassure yourself that you're not some kind of an odd duck doing something different. But if you end up sounding like one because you have had a teacher who brought attention to you about the notation that could lead to become a little bit more eccentric, and you're not as famous as Glenn Gould or somebody considered a great leader in the field, even if within the field could be discussed and possibly criticized and sometimes downplayed. You have the responsibility to build a student, not to, let's say, break a student by bringing them too much doubt, even if it's intellectually sound, given the fact that our only connection to the music of the past, when it was not recorded, is the written material. Which is why they all purchase texts, in the hope that because of that, every recited note will be the right note, since it's supposed to be the original text. But there are ways to voice out the text, there are ways to shape it, there are ways to sculpt it, right? So, my answer to the original question is, I will take an educated risk with a given student whom I trust in my intuition could stomach this contradiction in terms between the written and the heard, the expected and the intended, and could take time, which would be weeks, perhaps year, perhaps days. I don't know. I cannot be the one who filters their own levels of consciousness, awareness, and willing acceptance or questioning the status quo. One way or the other, the responsibility which I feel as a teacher, where I'm entrusted by the student, of course I'm aware of not being the only vector of their knowledge. They'll pick here, they'll pick there, and they'll do it anyway. But while I am one-to-one with a student who asks me this question, as a teacher I can say, oh, I like it that way, and don't even have to explain. Or I have to, perhaps, in that case, determine my choice by explaining my analytical understanding of the text. Will it convince the student because it's notated rather than how it's heard or understood by all other people who manage to play it despite of its notation the way that it's played? Does it make me right against all, as if I am in some kind of a, which I'm not, by the way, swimming against the tide fight or belief or some kind of a attitude? I'm not. I never entered in music through my childhood in order to fight, in the sense intellectually, ideologically, or in a way is only to enlarge horizons, first mine through studying, and then my students through my teaching. Now, do I trust that all of them will be able to make sense out of it for their own sake and become successfully convincing in turn, and differently from me, but at least informed? Or do I think that it will possibly, for some, be more difficult to process, and therefore it's preferable to just not even open Pandora's box and attempt to open horizons, because you would feel like the end result won't justify the means through which you reach a point, even if the cause of it is sincere, honest, earnest, after all. That's the dilemma. Do I choose the students to whom I open their horizons? Do I try to open their horizons to all the students? Do I need to? Do I have this calling or this mission of sorts that I would have self-imposed on myself? Of course not. Do I teach intuitively? Probably most teachers do anyway, some less than others. After all, if you're very analytical, you become more of a scholar. You write books, articles, documents, and give conferences. When you teach, it's an interaction with a student. It's malleable, it's ephemeral, it's sometimes funny, weird, sometimes weird in the sense musically. It becomes almost silly to over-explain what is intuitively so evident musically to the student. Why would they study with you in the first place if they don't hear it intuitively? And why are you there to contradict their intuition for the sake of it? Just because of a notational device? Or is that translating a composer's intent? And to which extent does it really matter? At the end, given the few seconds of the section in the whole piece, of a whole program, of a whole life of an artist? Probably not. But I had to share with you my doubts. I tried to bring enlightenment in that sense to the students who I feel need hear and perhaps could benefit from it. But I don't pick and choose, because who am I to play God to define that this is worthy more than the other? No, I think that if they are on my path, I have to respect them as humans, to respect them as fellow humans, regardless of the hierarchy of the teacher-student. Of course, that is fact. But to respect them is to take the risk to open their horizons in order to have them informed, and then guide them on the mid-short term through it by saying, okay, leave it on the side, perhaps you'll develop it later as a thought and integrate it different in your interpretation. That, I think, is probably the healthy outcome of this dilemma. But it's case by case. Perhaps if there is an intuitive musicianship, there might be an intuitive teaching, not only based on facts and pedagogical sound logic from causes to effects and how you reach from one to the other. Ultimately, the question is, do you play an intellectual piece, a form, a statement, an architectural blueprint, which after all, every music of classical music pieces is a reflection, it's not only but also, it vehicles itself through it. Of course, you can have a series of moods in a fantasy or a possible ballad-like novel writing, or you can have something very structured with very distinguished characters in the different themes, but within the form, without breaking the form to only extract the essence, and you keep the essence within the form. These are stylistic facts. These are understanding of textures given contexts of time periods. Fine. But ultimately, when you play through in a concert and on a regular bouquet of music program of most pianists, you have a Bach, a Beethoven, a Chopin, a Schumann, a Brahms, a Liszt, a Prokofiev, whatever, different time periods. It's like same instrument, same musician, but same dynamics for each, same climaxes for each, same expectations for each. Of course, they're coded in their own musical language, more or less common with the tonal system or not, or transformed, but it is. Ultimately, you're supposed to represent different types of musical beings in the same evening, playing in front of people, a variety of things. Of course, you could consider it more about the synergy of playing only, and it is, without which you don't have the art, if you don't have the technique to support it. But if it is it, then you don't go further than that, and that's good for competitions, of course, and that's essential. Accurate and always reliable. But beyond, you have to be creative in your interpretation. You have to renew yourself. You have to have depth of understanding, layers of hinting, suggested thematic materials. I think definitely it's worth the extra time, if you take it at heart as I do, to teach what you believe in and put it in perspective. Don't impose it, but suggest it, present it, and blend it with the other options, and then see how it plays out through the first encounters of the famous piece that you've played, that you've learned, that the student is in their first encounter with the piece. What they'll do with it when they go back to it later in their lives as teachers or performers or etc., it's their own. But you might have planted grains that will blossom in their interpretations, part of many different vectors from which they get their inspiration, besides the piece itself, obviously. It's humbling and sometimes almost mind-boggling how much it can be different from one to another and how alike most of them want to be. At least in the political correctness of the word, through the addition to the standardization of what is expected. Even if they do or they don't have enough self-confidence to be different, not for the sake of it, as I said, but with a certain background of analytical understanding that can back up intellectually a certain emotional or intuitive drive. Because I still believe at the end of it all, if you don't have the drive, there's no point to be even analytical. The one doesn't go without the other. I think in a way that's probably why both are necessary. The problem is to find the right blend, and you trust that the student will, going forward in their path in music, companionship with this famous piece that you've been in companionship with through your life, will find their own ways of meaning. You cannot only question yourself, but you have to bring some answers. Perhaps momentary answers, but answers. And you can question them later by changing your point of view. It's, I think, possibly the best way. It's a gift that keeps on giving, music, isn't it? Especially the reflective classical music, to call it as others say. Even if it's so much more than only classical in the style, obviously. Versus probably the music for entertainment. Classical music in general is for reflection for the listener. That less for the performer, that less for the student, and therefore for the teacher vehicling all this hyphenated between the dead composer and the young student. I repeat myself because I do, but that is a fact that recurs constantly in my mind when I teach. Be careful, don't push too much, don't explain too much, don't confuse too much, don't give too much details. When and how and at which level and with what language and with which examples and how you bring it very subtly so that it doesn't break the fragile but rooted construction of the piece for the students themselves, how to play the piece. It's a vulnerable strength. It's a strength in vulnerability. It's evolving and at the same time is rooted in some things that are deep and meaningful, intuitive and learned or knowledgeably noticed through the eyes and not only by the ears. And if you choose to prevail the ears as the root cause of your performance, then it's beautiful. Regardless if you could consider it, oh, it's wrong or right because the notation says this and that, but doesn't say how much or if it should be. Is it just a notational device, or is it a suggested interpretational demonstration of the texture in some three-dimensional layering? Whichever way I turn around the question, spinning it in my loud voice, sharing with you, self-questioning, I always go back to the same point. I think it's worth it, taking the leap of faith in intelligence rather than only in intuitive ear transmission, while not ignoring it. Well, that's that. Thank you for having taken the time.